Isn't that a lovely intro? It is so wonderful to be back here at Book Passage. It's been a while. I did not tour with my last book, or I would have been here. But it's great. It's great to be back, and thank all of you for coming today. I understand there are some other local events that might have stolen you away. So those of you who are here, I presume, are not basketball fans. But you will be leaving in 40 minutes.
We're recording it.
If I see people kind of squirming in their seats and they have an earbud in one ear, I'm gonna know what's going on. All right. Well, again, thank you for coming. Thank you for supporting your local independent bookstore. In addition to being a writer and opening with my daughter, it's really going to be her store. But we are so looking forward to opening an independent bookstore where I live in Portland, Maine, and it's going to be quite wonderful. My daughter is beside herself with glee and anticipation and terror. But it's going to be fun. In addition to all of that, I'm also the vice president of the Authors Guild, and our job, as we see it, is supporting the writing life. But in order to support the writing life, we feel that it is absolutely essential to support all areas of the ecosystem, by which we mean that there should be a place for large publishers, small publishers, print books, e-books, e-tailers, independent booksellers, and when the way to get crossways with the guild is to become predatory, is to want more than your share, is to do something that harms the ecosystem in some way, the entire ecosystem of publishing, of bookselling, of writing. Independent booksellers are, to my knowledge, the only ones in the ecosystem who have never been predatory. So independent booksellers have made my career, and it's just such a thrill to be able to come to iconic bookstores like this one, late in my career, and to see so many friends and to be part of this whole thing. I'm going to read a short part, but I thought before I did, I would take you immediately to the acknowledgments page here, because there is on it you will see one Bob Wilkins, who's here in the audience tonight, and who is usually my literary escort. And we were swapping some lies back there, and I was explaining to him why his name is in this book. And it was a very. I'm not going to repeat that, but I started telling Bob another story, which I will share with you. Bob, I think we've been together on probably every book of mine since the beginning, since I started coming to San Francisco. But the last one was particularly harrowing because we were supposed to be out somewhere in Palo Alto or I forget, where were we going, Bob? Do you remember?
I think it was Berkeley.
Was it Berkeley?
Yeah,
or someplace in Berkeley? And Bob had picked me up.
Mrs. Dalloway.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So we're headed to Mrs. Dalloway's, and Bob had picked me up at my. They put me in a hotel on Nob Hill. We make literally. He picks me up. We make like 2 turns, and suddenly we are gridlocked. And Bob is calling, was it 511 or whatever, to figure out what in the world is going on. It turns out something has happened on one of the bridges that we were heading toward. And clearly, we are not going to this bookstore in Berkeley, at least not by that direction. And so Bob immediately starts to recalibrate, calls the bookstore and says, well, we can sit here waiting to get on the bridge. If we do, we're probably not going to make it. If we go via the other bridge, that adds another 45 minutes or so to the trip, but we would get there. Do you have someone who can tap dance before the audience, for half an hour or so until we can arrive? And they said, yes, if that's the only way, yes, let's try to do that. let's just rejigger everything and we'll figure out a way to get this done. So Bob turns around. Now this is probably close to 10 years ago, so the GPS that you have in your car now, just think of this as a prototype with what we have then. Bob turns around and the voice comes on immediately, this female voice that clearly wants Bob to understand that he's just done the wrong thing. Right? So we start heading out of San Francisco in the exact opposite direction that we need to go. And block by block by block, the voice on the GPS is saying, turn around, turn around, turn around. This continues until we're in the middle of the Golden Gate Bridge, and it's still insisting on the Golden Gate Bridge that we turn around. Now the whole journey takes probably 45 minutes or an hour, as I remember, maybe longer. That's the way it is in my memory anyway. And for that entire trip, this disembodied woman's voice is telling Bob that now we're getting close now. We're getting really close to the store, coming at it from the opposite direction. It is still insisting that we go all the way back to San Francisco, over the Golden Gate Bridge again, all the way back to San Francisco. Become more and more insistent that we're going the wrong way, until we pull up right in front of the store. At which point the voice says, "You have arrived." and with Bob, you always do. Okay. You remember all of that, Bob? Was that fairly close?
You are totally accurate.
Okay. Well, the section I'm going to read for you tonight. Can you all hear, by the way?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. The section I'm going to read is not from the beginning of the book, so I need to give you just a little bit of background here. Okay. At the opening of the novel, Chief of Police Douglas Raymer is attending the funeral of Judge Barton Flatt, a man who has humiliated him on any number of occasions. It's Memorial Day weekend, and North Bath is in the midst of an unseasonal heat wave with temperatures ranging into the mid-90s. In Raymer's pocket is a garage door remote, the one found in his wife's car after her tragic death a year earlier. She slipped on a rug at the top of their stairs just as she was about to run off with another man, whose identity is a mystery that Raymer hopes to solve now, a year later, by means of the remote. In town, as the funeral drags on under the broiling sun, there is an accident at an old mill that is being converted into high-end condos. An explosion that causes one of the building's walls to collapse into the street, and which can be heard all the way out to the cemetery. Feeling the ground shake, Raymer, in his dress blues, passes out into the open grave and is rushed to the emergency room. And that's where we pick up the story. Wait, you fainted into the grave? Charisse's voice crackled with a mixture of radio static and disbelief. Sympathy would come later, Raymer knew. Probably when she saw him, saw the damage, which, in the warped mirror on the wall opposite where he sat, bare-assed, draped in a flimsy paper Johnny, was pretty damned impressive. His broken nose was swollen hideously, and both eyes were slits. He'd been told a doctor would be in to see him shortly, but that was nearly half an hour ago. And the examination room's air conditioning was in brutal contrast to the sweltering heat outside. His head throbbed dully, but apart from that, he didn't feel too bad. Certainly not as bad as he looked. The lightheaded, elsewhere feeling that he had suffered prior to losing consciousness out at Hilldale was gone, as was the dizziness. He was tempted to just get dressed and leave. But instead of hanging up his sweaty uniform, he'd made the mistake of draping it over the air conditioning unit. Putting it back on would be like donning a frigid, wet onesie. He shivered at the thought. Into the grave, Charisse repeated, apparently willing to concede the truth of what he was telling her, but still unable to wrap her mind around what had happened. Like, on top of the casket? No, he explained, his honor was still above ground. Why are you in the emergency room? It was my face that broke the fall, he explained. But never mind that. Tell me again what happened out at the mill. Because Charisse wasn't the only one having trouble processing recent events. The whole building actually... So you like slumped forward and rolled into the grave? I fainted, Charisse, okay? You know that matting they edge graves with? They say I tripped over that, but really I don't remember. Ask Gus. He saw the whole thing. And would be thrilled to recount the whole shit show, no doubt. According to the mayor, Raymer's knees hadn't buckled or anything. Rather, he had gone down like a tree. One minute you were standing there, and the next it was like timber! You went into that hole like it was dug to your exact specifications. You were just gone. You know, like when you try to stuff a cat in a bag, how there's always a leg sticking out? Raymer had just blinked at him. Why would he have ever stuffed a cat in a bag? Was Gus confessing to having drowned kittens at some point? Why did he imagine this was an experience other people would be familiar with? Well, it wasn't like that at all, Gus insisted. You went in clean and neat. There was just the sound you made when you hit bottom and then this big plume of dust. I don't think I ever saw anything like it, and I was in Korea. Korea, where he had spent the last 7 months of the conflict, was Gus's particular touchstone. It was one of the few times he had been out of upstate New York for an extended period. And his experience on that misbegotten peninsula, even more than his graduate work in government, was the reason he believed himself to be qualified to be the mayor of North Bath. Was it over there that he had done his cat stuffing? Raymer wondered. Charisse, he told her sternly, I want to hear about the mill, okay? Because I don't understand how that could happen. How does a whole building just fall down? Well, not the whole building, she said. Just the north wall, the one facing Lime Rock Street. The other walls are still standing, he said. How could that be? I'm just telling you what I was told. By who? Well, Miller's on the scene. Miller. Jerome's there too. Jerome. You're repeating everything I say, she said. Your brother Jerome. Jerome worked for the Schuyler Springs PD and served as a liaison officer between the department and the college and the mayor's office, doing exactly what, Raymer wasn't sure, except that Jerome was required to be on television a lot, either attempting to explain the inexplicable or obfuscate the perfectly clear. It's his day off, Charisse said, so he stopped by the station. He's got this joke he wants to tell you. When the call came in about the mill, he figured we could use a hand. Raymer sighed. Why is he acting like this? Because lately, Jerome had become increasingly solicitous about Raymer's welfare, always stopping by the station on some pretense, telling him jokes, calling him buddy. He's worried about you, Charisse said. Why? I'm worried about you. Why? Chief, she said, as if the answer to this question was so obvious it needn't be voiced. His head was hurting worse now, probably because of the fall, but possibly not. His head often hurt when he talked to Charisse. I mean, imagine, okay? She said. Please, he begged. Because Charisse was always asking him to imagine this or that, usually something extremely unpleasant, like trying to put a cat in a bag or some other Korean-type activity. Please don't, he said. Imagine, she said, imagine you're in a great big room with 10,000 other guys. Actually, I'm in a small room, all by myself, he said. And the guy in charge says, okay, show of hands. Who's passed out at a funeral? Stop, please, Raymer said. She ignored him, of course. Charisse believed, for some reason, that a vivid imagination was the true path to understanding. Passed out, she repeated, right into an open grave. Desist, he told her. This is a direct order I'm giving here. Yours would be the only hand in the air, Charisse noted. That's all I'm saying. Charisse. Okay, make it 100,000 guys if you want a million. It's still just you with his hand up, Chief. Actually, I wouldn't have my hand up either, Raymer said, reluctantly giving in to her scenario. Why would I admit something like that in front of 10,000 other guys? Well, imagine if you lied, you'd be electrocuted, she said. I've got a better idea, he said. Imagine you work for me and you have to do what I say. Tell Jerome I don't want to hear another stupid joke. Also remind him that he has no jurisdiction in Bath. Well, I'll tell him, but you know Jerome. I do. Also his sister. 2 peas in a pod. And the metaphor was particularly apt in this case, as they were twins. Have Miller come pick me up at the hospital. Well, he's busy at the scene. Where's your own car? Out at the cemetery. Gus wouldn't let me drive. Well, I'll call Jerome then. He won't mind. Don't, he told her. Do not call Jerome. I swear to God, if he comes out here, I'll shoot him on sight. Well, then you have exactly 0 friends, she said. All you got now is him and me. And I won't be your friend no more if you shoot my brother, because that would be unnatural. Anymore, Raymer said. You won't be my friend anymore. Well, there you go again, she said, making fun of how I talk. I'm going to add that to my list. Charisse claimed to be compiling a list of all the workplace shit he gave her. It had several distinct, if to Raymer's mind, overlapping categories of his abuse. Illegal, immoral, actionable, insulting, bigoted, and just plain wrong. She hadn't allowed him to see the list, but claimed it was growing and pretty comprehensive. Do you have any idea how bad my head hurts right now, Charisse? Well, that's why they took you to the hospital, to get yourself checked out. Stay there, why don't you? Jerome can handle things. Miller, you mean. Miller can handle things. It's Miller on our payroll, not Jerome. Well, Chief, we both know Miller can't handle anything. Don't matter whose payroll he's on. I don't care, Raymer said. Send somebody out to get me. Anybody but your brother, okay? And make sure whoever it is brings that big bottle of extra strength Tylenol that I keep in my desk. And a Diet Coke. Come yourself if you have to. Oh, I get it, she said. This is a test, right? Last week you chew my ass out for leaving the switchboard to pee, and now you want to see if I've learned my lesson. Goodbye, Charisse, he said. In 5 minutes, I'm going to be out on that bench outside the hospital, main entrance, not emergency. Somebody better be there. Head throbbing to a good beat now, Raymer slid off the examination table and wobbled over to his clothes on the air conditioner. His jockeys, no surprise, were still soaked with sweat, but also very, very cold. Imagine, he could almost hear Charisse say, imagine what did it feel like to pull those on? Like a wet bathing suit, all nasty and cold up there in your private place? Raymer closed his eyes and pulled them on. And Charisse was right. That was exactly how they felt. Well, thank you. I thought we would just chat now. You have any questions? Anything you'd like to bring up? Yeah, hi.
If this is an unfair question, you can pass.
Mm.
But you have...
That's what Terry Gross said the other night.
Not that good.
And I discovered on here that I was unable to pass, and I probably won't be able to here either, but go ahead.
Everything you write, you have such a wonderful ear, not just for dialogue and people expressing character, but that minute dance that people who know each other well go into.
Mm-hmm.
How did you draw that into yourself? Are you an expert eavesdropper?
No, I'm not. And you know, people often say, you must hear a lot of this because they know that until fairly recently I used to write in public places, and people used to think that when I'd hear an interesting line of dialogue, I would write it down. But you could wait forever. You know, it would be a great line of dialogue, but you could wait forever to use it. You know, so I never did anything like that. One of the first writing teachers I ever had just told me a very basic rule about dialogue, and that is that characters just have to speak out of their own need and not your need as an author. It's not their job to convey your information that you want the reader to know. It's their job to know I mean, if they're real, and I like to think of them as real. If they're real, they have an agenda of their own. There's certain things that they want and need, and like people in real life, they will persist until that need is answered in some way. And so, in the scene that I just read, Cherise simply can't let it go. I mean, she wants to know how this thing happened, and so far, what he's told her just doesn't make sense. And so, for me, so much of the joy in writing scenes, like the one that I just read, is giving characters more rope than perhaps another writer might. I mean, when she asked what happened, you know, another writer, or perhaps a beginning writer, emerging writer, whatever, might have him explain what happened to her, what happened to him in a short paragraph, right? And then she would have all the information. But you know, she has to interrupt him, and you know, it takes the better part of 2 pages for him to answer kind of a sentence at a time. And every time he tries to divert her, no, tell me about the mill, she just won't go there, because Cherise has something that she wants to get straight in her mind. And so it takes the better part of, you know, like 2 long pages to get what another writer might have done in a single paragraph. And I'm almost ashamed to tell you this, but I derive such incredible joy from just allowing these people to be themselves, just moving from one kind of true moment to the next. I mean, that's how I make these things work, in the sense that they take me 5 or 6 years to write. If I'm not having that kind of fun, kind of moment to moment, I just don't see myself ever finishing these books. But because I do things the way I do, and because I take something that another writer would do in 2 lines and I take 2 pages to do it, my books are, I think, they're for a particular taste. They don't. Not everybody enjoys spending 2 pages. Now that scene that I just read, you would be hard pressed, even if you'd read the whole book, you would be hard pressed to say exactly how those 2 pages forwarded the story. You know, you don't feel like in reading that you're moving closer towards the end of the book, or towards a plot revelation or anything. These are just people being people, and that's, you know, and over the years, I've just come to think that, you know what, the readers who like my work they're not going to mind lingering, as I don't mind lingering, and people who do, there are plenty of other books and plenty of other writers out there. They're just going to find their satisfaction with another kind of writer who's more efficient and just gets to the point quicker. For me, the point is just what I just read. That there is no other point really than just watching these people, you know, go about their own odd lives in their own odd way. So good to see you.
You too. Here goes my question.
Okay.
How do you start? How do you build it? How do you, a friend of mine was reading that said, you gotta be careful, there are a lot of characters in here.
Yeah.
So how do you populate it, and build it from there? Do they get born as you're writing, or you sit down at first and build that town and put people in it?
Yeah, the question is how much, there are just a lot of characters in most of my books, and certainly a lot of characters in this one. And so how do you build that? What do you know, when do you know it, sort of thing. Well, they certainly aren't all there at the beginning, although in this book a lot of them were there in the beginning simply because it was a sequel. So Sully and Rub and Carl Roebuck and even some of the dead characters, Miss Burrell was part of the earlier book. So some of these characters were there when I started, but obviously Charisse and her brother Jerome were not, and they're very important characters in this book. And some minor characters, I mean, Officer Raymer in this book was just a pawn in the earlier book that I moved around. And one of the chief villains in the earlier book, Nobody's Fool, was a guy named Roy Purdy, who was another pawn that was useful to me in the first book, but now he has stepped up in this book into kind of full-blown life and malice, and so yeah. What do you know when you start off? What do you know? How do you know what you're going to need and all of that? When you're an emerging writer, I think one of the things that makes your life as a writer so difficult is that unless you're particularly prescient, you probably, at least I didn't when I started out, even when I was getting better at handling my tools and I was taking classes and I was becoming more skilled, I still didn't even really know what kind of writer I wanted to be. And over the course of a writer's lifetime, you kind of just over the years and over the books get a sense of the kind of writer you are. And one of the early things that I learned was that my imagination, for whatever reason, and this takes place at a point before you've made any decisions about the kind of writer that you want to be, my natural instinct as a writer, my imagination typically goes outward. And I learned that fairly soon, and somewhat to my chagrin, because it's kind of dangerous. It's like an explosion or a jailbreak. Something happens and then there's a big bang and there's a bunch of characters all going in different directions. And so as soon as I see one character, as soon as I see Charisse, I see her brother for some reason. Why? Well, now you're getting into a psychological territory that I don't know that. I don't know that, but I do know that other writers that doesn't happen to. And as a matter of fact, what happens very often is that they not only write smaller books than I do because there aren't so many people in them, but typically their imagination, where mine goes out, their imagination goes in. So very often you'll find, and I don't mean to suggest that my way of doing things is right or that better books result, but there are certain kinds of writers who, when they get one or two or three really important characters, everything kind of revolves around them, and you go inward and deeper and deeper and deeper, right? And so you always have that sense that the world itself, the universe of the story, is never going to get much bigger than these two or three characters. And if other characters do appear, they become usually functionary in some way. They move the plot in this direction or other. But you never have the sense, as you do with Dickens, for instance, obviously one of my heroes. You never have this sense of a writer whose imagination is reckless and in some ways uncontrollable. I had the opportunity a couple of years ago to write the introduction to an everyman's edition of Pickwick Papers, Dickens' first novel. And it was, you could see, if you read Pickwick Papers, you can see an extraordinarily talented writer who had been writing short things for newspapers, periodicals, and you can see him actually in Pickwick Papers teaching himself to write a novel. He really didn't know how to do it. But Pickwick Papers is astonishing, and it is a jailbreak. I mean, and it's wonderful because it takes he uses exactly the right strategy when you don't know how to, when you haven't written a novel before and you don't necessarily know how it works. He just takes his main character, Mr. Pickwick, on a journey. And it began as a series of sketches. And so he goes from one place to another place to another place, and he meets new people in each new place that he goes. And because he was writing it serially, he could wait for one issue to come out. He could write issue 1 and then issue 2. But when he finished issue 2, he already had a pretty good idea from issue 1 what people who read issue 1 liked, you know? And if they wanted more of that, he gave it to them. And so Sam Weller, that you meet in the early chapters of the book, people loved Sam Weller, so Sam Weller is in the rest of the book. But what you really see with Dickens in that early going is a writer who just his imagination, when he discovered the novel, his imagination simply exploded in the most wonderful way. It's like a starburst. And to go back to your original question, one of the things that I learned early on is that my imagination was much more likely to work like that, and to trust the fact that if it turns out that Charisse has a brother, don't keep Jerome out of the book. If something in the back of your head says that Charisse should have a brother, then she has a brother. If it makes things more messy, if you don't know in the end what you're going to do with Jerome as a result of bringing him into the book, that doesn't matter. Something is telling you that it's right, and also that's going to be part of the joy of the book is to just people it really fully. So I don't know at the beginning typically what I'm going to need. I have my raw materials and just trust that something, why not? The more the merrier. It's a party. Bring as many people in as seem to be having a good time. Hi.
One of the things that's always struck me about your books from the very beginning is the way you approach the depth, your understanding of the depth and complexity of family relationships. And I think particularly in books like Mohawk or Rispo, that the father-son relationship, but just how you go into them in such an incredible way. I mean, that's one of the big draws for me. I think I've read all of your books. I wonder if you could talk some about that, where that comes from within you, because I think it's kind of the meat of so many of your novels.
I think the simplest way to describe it is I think that it comes from yearning. My parents split up when I was fairly young, and as a result of that, I lived with my grandparents. My mother worked really hard, and she had a full-time job 5 days a week, and was exhausted when she came home. My father was absent for most of my childhood, so I got to know him only when I turned 18, and we could drink together. Basically, was what it amounted to. And so family and the ways that ours were different, that our family was different from other families was intriguing, and I got the sense that ours was unusual. And of course, as a young kid, I would have liked to have had a family that was just like every other family. And when I got to know my father better, I discovered that he did the same thing that so many of the characters of the kind of rogue male characters did or do in my novels. Having Sam Hull in The Risk Pool and Sully in Nobody's Fool. These are men who leave their families, but as soon as they're shut of their families, they set about immediately to create other families, right? So So Sully has left his son, but he kind of adopts Rub, to whom he has no biological relationship. He leaves his wife, but he takes up immediately with another man's, and which suggests that there's something about family that we all strive for. In my later books, the father-son dynamic that you talk about in the earlier ones, of course, becomes a father-daughter relationship in some cases, especially Empire Falls. And by that time, I think it shifts because by that time I was a father myself. And as a father who didn't have the benefit of a father in his own young life, my relationship to my daughters, my then growing daughters, was deeply mysterious to me. I was kind of making it up as I went. And add to that, as a result of all the things that I've been talking about, I've always been deeply mystified by the very notion of family. And I've spent much of my adult life wondering to what extent blood really means anything at all. Because I've run into other people in my family, some of whom I love dearly, and others of whom I won't say I have no use for, but I'm not close to. And many of them will often say, well, you know, there's nothing more important than family, by which they mean blood. I kind of agree with them that there's nothing more important than family, but my definition of it I don't think is really anything like theirs. And my dearest cousin, first cousin, said that to me one time. Well, there's nothing, he was trying to explain something about the intimacy of our relationship and how fond we are of each other. He said, well, there's nothing more important than family. And I found it very difficult to agree with him because, yeah, we're related by blood, but that's not what it is. He's just dear to me, and it has nothing to do with the fact that the blood coursing through his veins has a lot of the same genetic material as the blood coursing through mine. So it's just a question, family is a question that is just trying to define it, and what obligations we owe to other people as a result of the various ties that bind us all. It's just a question that I find just unfathomable. I come back to it again and again, not because I know something about it, but because I want to. I'd love to understand how this works. To whom do we owe particular obligations? Anybody know the answer to that? Please, come up here. Hi.
Hi. Excuse me, I just finished the book this morning.
Mm-hmm.
Fabulous. And I got an advance copy from Gary and Ruthie, my daughter, who I think you know.
Ruthie is your daughter?
Yes, she is.
Oh, she is aces. She is absolutely aces.
That's not why I'm here because I'm a decades-long fan. But talking about Rub, talk about the dog. Not the wrong book, sorry.
Yeah, yeah.
Fabulous cover, love the dog. Talk about Rub and Rub.
Rub and Rub, yeah. Well, Sully in this new book, I don't want to spoil it. I can tell you a little bit about the two Rubs without spoiling an awful lot. Sully's friend Rub from Nobody's Fool is back, of course, in Everybody's Fool, and he's essentially the same Rub, except that he's in a little bit worse situation now, because since in the last 10 years, since Sully isn't doing, his leg won't allow him to do hard construction anymore. Sully has gotten Rub a job as the town gravedigger. And Rub is just unhappy because he's not spending every day with Sully, his best friend. And so he spends much of his time out at the cemetery wishing, that's his favorite word actually, I wished. No, I wished. And he just wishes that he could spend every minute of his day with his best friend, and there simply is no substitute. Sully's relationship with Rub is interesting because he does admit that Rub is in some ways kind of his best friend, but Sully has no desire to spend every waking minute of his day in life in Rub's company, listening to him wish all day long. And Sully's I mean, Sully. I think Sully, in his heart of hearts, loves Rub dearly, and would make great sacrifices for him. But Sully being Sully, he also delights in a certain kind of torment. And so when Rub finds a dog starving, wet and cold, starving along the side of the road, and takes him home to his wife, Bootsy, who immediately throws the dog out. She's saying she has a 1 cur limit in her house. So Sully takes the dog, Rub takes the dog and gives him to Sully, who doesn't want the dog, but takes him anyway, and just to, so if he's going to take the dog, he's going to exact a little bit of revenge against the man that gave it to him, and so he names the dog Rub, just so that he can give commands, and just to see which one of them will obey, if either. Rub the dog, I think, actually, again, I won't say too much more here because I don't want to spoil it for you, but I think I love Rub on the cover of this book, because that dog, it's not necessarily that Rub in the book is a Jack Russell Terrier. He might be, I have no idea what he is. I think he's a mongrel of some sort. But I love the dog in this photo because the dog in the photo looks like what I wanted Rub the dog to represent in the book, which is an unfailing optimism in the face of experience. Nothing has happened to this dog that would cause him to imagine that the future is going to bring him anything more than what he has suffered in the past. And yet, there he is. And and in that sense, the two Rubs are a lot alike. But you look at this dog on the cover, and he is looking backwards. And something, you can tell, something is coming toward him, and he just can't wait for it to get there, despite the fact that it is probably not going to be good. and he represents a kind of the triumph of hope over experience, I guess. And I just love him. I love the fact that he chooses Dick, and most of us do, metaphorically at least, in some way or another. And it also occasioned for me probably my favorite line in the entire novel. It takes place about 2/3 of the way through, and Carl Roebuck arrives at the horse with one of his young girls on his arm, and this girl sees Rub's half chewed off little Dick, and she says, "What's wrong with Rub's penis?" And Sully says, "He chews it," and she says, "Doesn't that hurt?" And his line, my favorite in the book, is, "You're asking me?" See, these are the moments I live for. This is why I'm a writer. There's nothing more profound than that going on.
So I read them backwards. I read Everybody's Fool. Now I'm reading those.
Yeah.
Everybody in the book has a character that I know.
Mm-hmm.
I know these people.
Thank you. That's it.
No, I'm serious. And so, do you know these people? I mean, like in your surroundings.
I get to know them.
So, in your mind, or like, can you look around you and say, "Oh my God, there's Rob, there's Sully, there's." I mean, have you seen them before?
No. Well, they all start probably with somebody, a recollection of a certain person or a certain event or a certain line of dialogue or something. I'm incapable of telling literal truth,
Okay.
for very long, and so I just think of, all right, here's what this person said in real life, but I'm sure I can improve on that, and then I just improve and pretty soon, whoever the character was based on takes on a life of his or her own. I've never made any bones of the fact that Sully in this book was based on my own father. But if somebody said, "Is he your father?" I would have to say no. I've started off with a character who has some things in in common. They tend to be fairly mundane things. My father, at some point in his life, he did hard construction work like Sully does in this book. And at one point he fell off a ladder and shattered his knee, so there's that in common. But Sully, despite being based on my father, exists primarily, I think, in my own mind and imagination, and then in your mind and imagination when you read. And that was true even of my mother, interestingly enough, because when she read Nobody's Fool, she kind of looked at me with this look of profound failure to understand, because of course she recognized her former husband, and she says, it's the most amazing thing. On the page, I just like him so much.
Was it more difficult for you to write elsewhere?
Elsewhere was brutal. Yeah. Elsewhere was brutal. I actually interrupted this book in order to write Elsewhere. I interrupted a book that I was having a blast writing to write a book that I didn't want to write at all, even a little. And I guess I wrote it because I felt I had to. After my mother's death, it just felt like there was some unfinished business there. She was in my dreams a lot. I was thinking about her and how hard her life had been and how valiantly she had fought. And it just seemed to me that I had to honor that in some way, despite the fact that I knew she would never have wanted me to write that book. But I did. I knew I had to write it. What I didn't know was whether I had to publish it. That was a different question entirely. And it was actually my daughters who said that I should. The demon, the particular demon that, and she was never diagnosed, so this is an amateur. This is kind of an amateur guess. I mean, she was part of my life for my entire life, you know, right up until she died. So it's not a professional diagnosis, but there's no doubt in my mind, and there's no doubt in the minds of either of my daughters, that she either suffered from generalized anxiety disorder or more particularly probably OCD. And over the years, you know, if you don't do anything about it, that's something that will eat you alive, and that's ultimately, I think, what it did her. And it seemed to me that you know, kind of revealing the secret that she had spent most of her life trying to keep was an act of perhaps serious betrayal. But it was my daughters, both of whom, who said, you know what? There are a lot of people out there who either are taking care of somebody like this, or are suffering these things themselves, and they don't know what it is. Imagine how much comfort they're going to get, knowing that whatever is tormenting them or tormenting someone they love. Imagine the comfort that they're going to get from knowing that they're not alone. And that was a pretty, I think, potent and convincing reason to do it. Although, frankly, having done it and finally deciding to publish the book and let it out into the world, that's the book that I didn't tour with, because one of my dearest writing friends is Andre Debussy III, who published a novel, or published a memoir called Townie about a year and a half before my memoir came out. And his experience terrified me. The first thing he said, I'm writing this memoir, I don't know if I should publish it. And he's telling me this at about the time that I was thinking about writing Elsewhere. And he said, I have this story to tell, and I don't want to fudge it, I want to tell the truth, but there are living people involved, and it just feels like a terrible thing, a betrayal. And of course his father was a famous writer, Andre Debussy Sr. And so he writes the book, and he asked me, what do you think I should do? And I said, well, are you writing it to settle a score? And he said, God, no. I said, well, if you're not writing it to settle a score, if it's not written out of anger, or you know, if you're really trying to get to the bottom of something that seems to you important, then by all means write the book. And that's easy advice to give somebody else about their book. It's a little bit more difficult when you have to try to apply it to your own. But Andre's experience, and he toured with the book everywhere, and his experience just terrified me, because people came up to him after gatherings like this, and the portrait that Andre wrote of his famous author father could have been vindictive had he wanted to be, but in fact it's the kindest, most loving portrait of a father imaginable, despite the fact that this is a man who abandoned his family. And people came up to Andre on the road and said, what an asshole your father was. I'll never be able to read him again. And that wounded Andre right to his core. And so when it came time, you know, my memoir gets published, elsewhere gets published, and it comes time, I just called my editor and just said, you know what, I've been a soldier, I've been a good soldier up to this point, and I promise when the next book comes out, I will be an even better soldier. But I just don't think I can do this. I don't think I can go on the road and have people come up to me and tell me what a bitch my mother was. I couldn't risk it. I just couldn't do it. I did tour a little bit with the paperback but just because of the fact that number one, none of the book critics who reviewed the book said that I was an unnatural and unfeeling and asshole of a son. But also because I had seen enough people afterwards who came up to me and said thank you. So I did tour a little bit with the paperback, but only I was just such a cowardly thing. Once I knew it was going to be okay, I went out with it. But at first, I just couldn't do it. How are we doing time-wise?
I think we should do one
more question?
Make it good, though.
Okay.
No pressure.
I hope
Hi.
it's a good one. I'm always curious to hear what an author's writing process is.
Mm-hmm. Well, it has. What's my writing process? I always hate to answer this question because it reveals how lazy I am. My writing process, in some respects, is the same as it was when I was a younger writer, and in some respects, it has changed enormously. The amount of time that I spend has remained fairly constant over what's now turned out to be a much longer career than I imagined it would. But typically, I like to work 2 hours, no more than 2.5 hours in the morning. I usually write in longhand because that's the way I've always done it. And usually I'll work another 2.5 hours in the afternoon. And usually that's when I'm typing what I wrote in the morning onto the computer, but it's also my first revision too, because some of it doesn't stand up even 2 hours later. A lot of it doesn't stand up 2 hours later. So you're still trying to fix it in that afternoon. So that's a 5-hour day. That's not particularly impressive. I do work 7 days a week, but it's still south of what most people do who hold down other kinds of jobs that work much longer hours than that. I can kid myself into saying, well, you know, when I finish with my workday, I do a lot of reading, and reading is part of a writer's life, and you can't be a writer without reading all the time. And many writers say that reading is as vital a part of their workday as actually putting pen to paper. I don't know how to answer that question. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't, but that's what I do. And I have found over the years that trying to extend my day out of some sort of Catholic guilt, for instance, that working longer hours, I can feel virtuous about it, but it doesn't mean I get any more done. And anything I write after a certain amount of time just turns out not to be very good. And so why not stop? When you stop writing well, why not stop writing altogether? Which is what I do. Which you know, amounts to that period of time. The way my process has changed from a younger writer to an older writer is that I used to have this ability when I was young, and and had a certain brashness, a certain chutzpah. I used to think, you know, in my first 3 novels, for instance, I would just think, well, you know, look at this paragraph. It's ugly, it's misshapen, the sentences are grotesque, and I would just think, it's all right, we'll fix it later. And I would just move on, and I was always kind of pushing towards try to find out how the story ends, and I slept like a baby, despite the fact that I knew that there was an awful lot of crap on those pages. My feeling was, you know, there's a saying in the film industry, when you shoot a scene and you know you didn't get it right, the actors didn't get it right, or there's something wrong in the script, or the sun went under a cloud when it wasn't supposed to, or it came out when it wasn't supposed to. There are all kinds of things that can go wrong when you're shooting a movie, and they will. Those things will find you. And so at the end of the day, you've just spent a shitload of money, and you know the scene's not right. And there's a saying that they have in the movie business: we'll fix it in post, right? In post-production. Because really, you have to move on. It's too expensive, and so you kid yourself, you say to yourself later that we spent all the money that we can. We're just going to have to cut it up later, put it back in a different way, splice things together. We'll use cuts from other scenes. We'll get an expression that was closer to what we want from the actor who didn't give it. You know, there are all kinds of ways to kind of cobble this together at the end and make it better. But in the back of your mind, you know this is not right. As I have gotten older, that and as I know now how many different ways there are to screw up a novel and how difficult it is to write even a bad one, as I've gotten older, my anxieties, I think, have increased to the point where when I see that page in all of its ugliness, the misshapen sentences, the fact that the scene isn't structured the way it should be something at the end, should be at the beginning, and I look at all of this and I just cannot move on. So my revision process now, as opposed to when I was younger, is that I spend an awful lot more time thinking about structure, trying to get things right, even fiddling with the sentences, because so often I have found as I've gotten older, the key to what's missing is sometimes in the language. And so if you haven't gotten the language right, if you've chosen the wrong word, the word or the image may open the door to whatever's wrong in the scene. And so it takes me now, as a result of this, and I'm not sure what I'm doing now is better than what I was doing before, just different. And it just, you know, that's just the way I've become in my old age now. Is it takes me twice as long to do half as much, and I really wish that I could return to that young man's psychology. We'll fix it in post. We're certainly not going to worry about it for the next 5 years until the book is done. But in fact, that's where I am right now. We're going to worry about it for the next 5 years. The way this is going to be. Okay, thank you all so much for coming.